Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly through time and find ourselves standing on the muddy edge of the Nile River in ancient Egypt. The sun hasn't even fully risen yet, but the air already feels warm, thick, and a little unforgiving. You glance around, trying to take in the strange new world you've just landed in: mud brick houses in the distance, tall reeds swaying by the riverbank, and a handful of villagers already awake and working like the day has been going on for hours. And right about now, you begin to realize something important: you probably won't survive this, not because anything dramatic happens immediately, no angry pharaoh charging at you, no cinematic sandstorm rolling in from the desert. No, the real challenge here is much quieter. It's the heat, the labor, the insects, the food, the expectations. And the fact that in ancient Egypt, comfort is not exactly a top priority. Before things get too intense though, let's pause for just a second. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and while you're settling in, drop a quick comment telling me where you're listening from and what your local time is right now. It's always fun seeing people tuning in from different corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shift your feet in the cool mud along the Nile's edge. The river flows slowly beside you, wide and calm, reflecting streaks of pale orange sunlight as the horizon begins to glow. The Nile is everything here. Without it, this entire civilization simply wouldn't exist. Mainstream historians agree on one thing: ancient Egypt thrived almost entirely because of this river. Each year, the Nile flooded its banks, spreading rich, dark soil across the surrounding land. That fertile mud, called black land by the Egyptians, allowed farmers to grow crops in the middle of an otherwise brutal desert. Right now, though, you're mostly noticing something else: mosquitoes, lots of them. They buzz around your ears with a level of enthusiasm that feels deeply personal. You swat at the air half-heartedly, realizing very quickly that this might be your life now. A man nearby is already hauling baskets of wet soil toward a small field. His movements are steady and practiced, like someone who has done this every morning for most of his life. He barely glances at you, which is good news, because explaining time travel before sunrise sounds exhausting. You follow him at a distance, stepping onto a narrow path leading away from the river. The ground feels firm but uneven. Mud brick houses cluster together ahead, their flat roofs catching the early light. These homes are built from bricks made of mud mixed with straw, dried under the sun until they harden. It's a simple construction method, but incredibly effective in this environment. The thick walls actually help keep the interior cooler during the day. Cooler, though, doesn't necessarily mean comfortable. A goat wanders past you with the confidence of an animal that knows it owns the place. Somewhere nearby, a donkey brays loudly, as if announcing the official start of the workday. And the workday here starts early, really early. Ancient Egyptians typically began working at sunrise to avoid the worst heat of midday. Farmers, laborers, builders, fishermen, everyone moved quickly once the sun came up. The rhythm of life followed the river and the sun almost perfectly. You're still adjusting to the idea that this entire civilization runs without electricity, engines, or even basic modern tools, and somehow, they still manage to build pyramids. Scholars still argue whether the pyramid builders were mostly paid laborers or a rotating workforce of farmers fulfilling state duties during the Nile's flooding season. For a long time, people believed the pyramids were built by slaves. But archaeological discoveries, like worker villages near Giza, suggest that many of these laborers were actually organized crews with rations, housing, and medical care, which sounds slightly reassuring, until you remember the scale of those projects. Up ahead, the village is waking up fully now. Women kneel beside grinding stones, crushing grain into flour. The rhythmic scrape of stone on stone creates a low, steady sound that somehow feels almost peaceful. You watch as one woman mixes the flour with water to form a rough dough. Bread will be the main food today. Bread and beer. Now, before you judge ancient Egyptian beer too harshly, it wasn't exactly the same as modern beer. It was thick, cloudy, and more like a grainy drinkable porridge. But it was also safer to drink than river water in many cases. A slightly alarming thought crosses your mind: you might spend this entire day surviving mostly on bread. An ancient beer, honestly, that could go either way. Nearby, a group of children run through the narrow street chasing a small dog that clearly regrets all of its life choices. Their laughter echoes between the mud brick walls. Despite the harshness of this environment, life here is surprisingly lively. Markets will open later. Boats will move up and down the Nile carrying grain, stone, and pottery. Temple priests will begin rituals honoring gods with names that still echo through history. Ra. Osiris, Isis, Anubis. Religion is everywhere in ancient Egypt. Every sunrise, every flood, every harvest is tied to divine forces, and if you're hoping to survive even a single day here, you might want those gods on your side. The sun climbs higher now, and the warmth quickly turns into something heavier. The kind of heat that presses gently but persistently against your skin. You already miss air conditioning. In the distance, the desert stretches outward in pale gold waves of sand and rock. Egypt is mostly desert, more than 90% of the land is dry. Empty wilderness. Nearly everyone lives close to the narrow ribbon of green along the Nile, which means villages like this are busy, crowded, and constantly active. A strange smell drifts through the air. It's a mix of wet earth, animals, bread baking, and smoke from small cooking fires. Not exactly unpleasant. Just very real. You take a slow breath and look around again. This place is ancient, complicated, and far less comfortable than your modern brain expected, and the day has barely started. Soon the real work will begin, fields to tend, food to prepare, orders to follow, and a sun that will only grow hotter with each passing hour. If you're already feeling tired, don't worry. That's completely normal. After all, surviving a day in ancient Egypt was never meant to be easy, and you've only just arrived. The light grows stronger as the sun slowly climbs over the eastern horizon, and with it the entire village seems to shift into a faster rhythm. What felt calm and sleepy just moments ago now hums with quiet determination. You realize very quickly that ancient Egyptian mornings are not slow, peaceful affairs. They are efficient. Purposeful. Everyone seems to know exactly what they should be doing, and apparently. So should you. A farmer gestures toward the fields beyond the village, not in an aggressive way, more like the casual assumption that if you're standing here, you must be part of the workforce. You follow the dirt path leading toward the open farmland, still adjusting to the heat that is already beginning to settle over the land like a heavy blanket. The Nile glimmers nearby, wide and steady, its waters moving slowly but constantly. Small wooden boats glide across the surface. Some carry bundles of reeds, others baskets of grain or pottery jars. A fisherman balances at the edge of one narrow boat, carefully lowering a net into the water. Fishing along the Nile was a major source of food in ancient Egypt. Tilapia, catfish, and other freshwater species were common catches. In fact, fish appears regularly in ancient Egyptian artwork, carved into tomb walls and painted in bright colors. You pause for a moment watching the fisherman. He moves with quiet patience, like someone who understands the river better than words could explain. A strange buzzing noise interrupts your thoughts. Flies. Lots of them. This is one of those small historical details people rarely imagine when they picture ancient Egypt. The beautiful temples and golden artifacts are easy to admire. The constant presence of insects. Less so. Flies hover around food, animals, and basically anything that stays still long enough. You wave your hand lazily in front of your face. Already realizing that this battle cannot be won, the farmland stretches out ahead of you in neat strips of dark soil. This is the famous fertile land created by the Nile's yearly flooding. Every summer, rains far south in Africa cause the river to rise. When the floodwaters spread over the land, they leave behind thick, nutrient-rich mud. That mud is the secret behind Egypt's agriculture. Mainstream historians note that ancient Egyptian farmers typically grew crops like wheat, barley, flax, onions, and lentils. Wheat and barley were especially important because they were used to make bread and beer, the two absolute staples of daily life. You watch as several workers move through a field carrying simple wooden tools. One man pushes a plow pulled by a pair of oxen. The tool scratches shallow lines into the soil, preparing it for seeds. The plow itself is surprisingly basic, no metal blades. Just wood, And yet it works. Another worker scatters seeds from a woven basket, swinging his arm in a wide motion that sends tiny grains falling across the fresh soil. A few birds immediately attempt to take advantage of the situation, swooping down with shameless opportunism. A boy nearby waves a stick and shouts, chasing the birds away like a very enthusiastic security guard. You notice something interesting about the workers here. Most of them are barefoot. Sandals existed in ancient Egypt, usually made from woven papyrus or leather, but many laborers worked barefoot in the fields. The mud was soft, and sandals would often get stuck or damaged during farm work. You cautiously step onto the edge of the field and immediately understand the decision. The mud is cool and soft between your toes. Not terrible, actually. Kind of pleasant, at least until another mosquito lands on your arm. Scholars still argue whether farming life in ancient Egypt was relatively stable or brutally demanding depending on the time period. Some historians suggest that when Nile floods were predictable and crops were good, farmers could live fairly secure lives. But if the floods were weak or came too late, harvests could fail, and famine became a very real threat. Standing here under the growing sun, it's easy to imagine how much these people depend on the river behaving properly each year. One bad flood could change everything. A farmer nearby lifts a clay jar and takes a long drink before wiping his mouth with the back of his arm. He offers the jar toward you with a friendly nod. Inside is beer. Ancient Egyptian beer was thick, slightly sour, and full of grain particles. It was brewed using partially baked barley bread soaked in water and left to ferment. The result looked less like a modern drink and more like something halfway between soup and a smoothie. You take a cautious sip. It's not amazing, but it's surprisingly refreshing in the heat, and importantly, it contains calories and nutrients. For many workers, beer wasn't just a beverage, it was part of their daily food supply. Some laborers even received beer as part of their wages. Yes, getting paid in beer was a real thing, not the worst system, depending on your perspective. You hand the jar back, trying to look like someone who absolutely drinks ancient grain beverages on a regular basis. The sun climbs higher, the warmth turns into proper heat now, and the workers begin moving more quickly, trying to accomplish as much as possible before midday. Sweat beads across your forehead almost instantly. Somewhere nearby, someone begins singing. It's a steady rhythmic chant, likely meant to keep everyone working at the same pace. Other workers gradually join in. The song echoes softly across the fields, carried by the warm morning air. Work songs like this were common in many ancient societies. They helped coordinate group labor and made repetitive tasks feel a little less endless. A small herd of cattle passes along a nearby path, guided by a young boy who looks no older than 10. He moves with confidence though, occasionally tapping the animals with a stick to keep them moving. Children in ancient Egypt often began helping with work at an early age. Life expectancy was much shorter than today, and families depended on everyone contributing. You suddenly notice something odd happening at the edge of the field. A man has placed a small clay statue beside a cluster of crops. He bows his head briefly before returning to work. Religion again. Even something as simple as planting crops could involve offerings to the gods. Egyptians believed many deities influenced the success of agriculture, including Osiris, who was strongly connected with fertility and the life cycle of plants. If the gods were pleased, the crops would grow. If not, well, that was a much more worrying possibility. The breeze shifts slightly, bringing with it the smell of wet soil and river water. For a moment, the scene is almost peaceful, farmers moving steadily through the fields, the Nile flowing quietly nearby, birds circling overhead, but you're already feeling the toll of the heat, and this is still early morning. You glance toward the rising sun and begin to understand something important about surviving here. Ancient Egypt isn't just beautiful monuments and mysterious hieroglyphs, it's hard physical work, every single day, and the day you're trying to survive has barely reached its first hour of real labor. By the time the sun climbs another hand's width into the sky, the gentle warmth of morning has officially turned into real Egyptian heat. The kind that settles onto your shoulders like an invisible blanket and quietly reminds you that the desert is never very far away. You're now fully in the fields, standing ankle-deep in dark Nile mud, watching the farmers move with practiced efficiency. At first glance the work seems simple: plant seeds, guide oxen, carry water, but the longer you stand here, the more you realize how relentless it actually is. There are no coffee breaks, no shady office chairs, just sun, soil, and the slow rhythm of survival. The farmer you followed earlier hands you a wooden hoe. It's surprisingly light but rough along the edges, the handle polished smooth from years of use. You grip it awkwardly, trying to copy the motion of the workers nearby as they loosen soil around small rows of barley. You swing once, the tool hits the ground with a dull thud. You swing again, this time the soil actually breaks apart. Progress. But after about 10 swings your arms are already starting to complain. The farmers around you, meanwhile, move with calm endurance, their bodies used to this kind of effort. Farming was the backbone of ancient Egyptian society. Historians widely agree that nearly everyone, directly or indirectly, depended on agriculture. Even craftsmen and soldiers relied on the grain produced here, and the grain, of course, relies entirely on the Nile. You watch as 2 oxen slowly pull a wooden plow across another section of field. Their hooves sink into the mud with heavy squelching sounds, while the farmer guiding them clicks his tongue and nudges them forward. It's slow work, but steady, and steady was exactly what this civilization needed. Barley and emmer wheat are the main crops here. Emmer wheat, in particular, was a staple grain in ancient Egypt. It had a tough outer husk that required extra work to grind, but it grew reliably in the Nile's fertile soil. You glance at the horizon, squinting slightly. In the far distance, beyond the green strip of farmland, you can see the pale gold of the desert. That thin ribbon of fertile land along the Nile was often only a few kilometers wide. Beyond it, nothing but sand and rock. This narrow strip of green is the reason Egypt existed at all. A worker beside you wipes sweat from his forehead and gestures toward the sky. The sun isn't even at its highest point yet, and it already feels intense. Ancient Egyptian farmers had to carefully manage their time during the hottest months. Most heavy labor happened early in the morning and later in the afternoon, when the sun wasn't quite as brutal. Right now, though, the work continues. You try another swing with the hoe, loosening soil around a row of young plants. A small frog suddenly jumps out of the mud and disappears toward a nearby irrigation ditch, which brings you to another clever part of Egyptian farming, irrigation. Mainstream historical records show that Egyptians developed an early irrigation system using canals and basins. Farmers would dig channels that allowed Nile water to flow into their fields. The water would soak the soil before being drained away, leaving behind fertile sediment. Simple, but brilliant. You walk over to one of these shallow canals. Water flows quietly through it, reflecting the sunlight in bright flashes. Tiny fish dart through the shallow stream, occasionally vanishing into the murky water. A worker nearby uses a tool called a shaduf, a long wooden pole balanced on a frame with a bucket on one end and a counterweight on the other. He lowers the bucket into the canal, lifts it with the help of the counterweight, and pours the water into a higher irrigation channel. It's essentially an ancient water lifting machine, and surprisingly effective. You try lifting the bucket once when he offers you the chance. The motion feels awkward at first, but the counterweight makes it easier than expected. Still, doing this for hours would be exhausting. Scholars still argue whether the agricultural calendar in ancient Egypt allowed farmers significant downtime during the Nile flooding season. Some theories suggest that when fields were underwater, farmers worked on state projects instead, building temples, roads, or even pyramids, which means the break might not have been much of a break at all. A sudden shout echoes from across the field. You look up just in time to see a flock of birds swooping down toward freshly planted seeds. Several workers wave their arms and throw small clumps of mud into the air to scare them off. Birds were one of the many small challenges farmers faced here. Locusts could be even worse, capable of destroying crops in massive swarms. And then there were the hippos. Yes, hippos. The Nile once hosted large populations of them, and while they may look slow and slightly goofy from a distance, hippos were actually extremely dangerous. They could easily destroy crops and irrigation channels if they wandered too close to farmland. One ancient Egyptian text even describes organized hippo hunts to protect agricultural land. You wipe sweat from your forehead again, the sun climbs higher, your shoulders ache from the unfamiliar labor. Your feet are now thoroughly coated in mud, and you've lost count of how many mosquitoes have tried to sample your blood, yet the farmers around you continue working with steady focus. They chat occasionally, laugh sometimes, and occasionally break into short songs again while working. There's a rhythm to it all, a rhythm you're still trying to learn. One older farmer pauses beside you and studies your awkward technique with mild amusement. He gently adjusts your grip on the hoe, demonstrating a smoother motion. You copy it. This time the tool cuts through the soil more easily. Progress again. He nods once, satisfied, before returning to his row. The breeze picks up slightly from the river, carrying the smell of wet earth and growing crops. For a moment, despite the heat and effort, the scene feels strangely peaceful, a living system thousands of years old, farmers, river, soil, sun, all working together. But you're starting to realize something. Surviving here isn't about dramatic dangers, it's about endurance, the heat, the labor, the endless cycle of planting, watering, harvesting, and right now, you're only a few hours into a day that people here repeat for their entire lives. Your arms are sore, your clothes feel heavy with sweat, and the sun still has a long way to climb.